Okay, so part two. Hello again, Sharon.
Hello.
Um, so last week we went through the first parts of the 7S plus a few model that we worked out over the course of the last few weeks, thinking about organisations wanting to make a shift from being on-premise, in the office organisations through where we're at the moment, which is in this sort of weird lockish down mode. As organisations come out of the lockdown, but what will be the things that organisations who want to really take advantage of being able to be location agnostic going forward, what will be the things that they will need to do and consider to be able to take advantage of it?
It's been quite a week, hasn't it? In the week since weekish since we did the last post, there's been a lot of movement in that direction. So in the last couple of days, MasterCard have said to people they need to consider working at home until a vaccine is found, which could be never, or some other kind of approach is taken. Facebook have announced, I think yesterday, in a call that they're expecting 50% of their workforce to be remote moving forward. And they started to talk about some of the challenges around that. So this has gone from being, a bit of a pipe dream to many organisations we're looking at how can we make this work, but not just make it work, but turn it into a strength for our organisation.
Yeah, and this is the thing, isn't it? It's about being able to think of this as enablers to better organisations rather than barriers to overcome, which is where I think a lot of it has been in the sort of the lockdown period. And then, of course, we're getting the mixed kind of messages from the top in the UK where Parliament seems to be just heading back to business as usual, although there seems to be underlying political performance issues maybe underpinning that decision, if we're going to be subtle about it. Just before we get back into the grid, I just wanted to share a little bit of research work we've been doing in my organisation. So I head up technology transformation for a social housing provider based in London. We've got staff who are, or were traditionally very office based. We've got people who are very remote. So we've got caretaking staff and maintenance staff who are actually based wherever they need to be able to do the work. We also have people who are based, we've got some retirement schemes and sheltered accommodation for people with disability. And so we have people who are office based but remote because they were in the small offices in those schemes rather than in the main office. And we've been asking groups across the business a number of questions. The two that you've got here, the yellow ones are responses to what's been working well through the lockdown period, and the blue ones are what have the frustrations been. And there's been some stuff that I kind of expected, but I think more than anything, we were a very, very office-based organisation when this started. And I've been delighted to see how much enthusiasm there is amongst the staff to think about how we change our ways of working to be able to really take advantage of what they can now see as the possibilities of not having to go into an office to be tied to a desk. The sorts of things that have come up that I think actually the accelerated learning around use of technology, which you can see on that, have learned what benefits there are through using tech. That's come through quite strongly. That actually for the part of the group that this response set came from were the scheme managers. And they actually are expressing how they feel much more of a team now because the whole organisation is now kind of working in the way that they have forever, which is, alone in a place where your immediate colleagues are not there. But now, because everybody's using video conferencing and chat and all this stuff that wasn't being used before, they're feeling much more included with things. This thing about people being kinder to each other, more considerate, more explicit about how we're thinking about our interactions is really interesting. And then this stuff around the personal life, not the work-life balance stuff. And that can have some negatives as well about how you make sure you stop working. But I just, getting better at cooking or deciding to go and get a puppy because they have the time to be able to do that kind of thing. And I think in a lot of organisations, this sort of stuff would be, they wouldn't even bother noting that down. That'd be frippery. But that's so important, how people can see this.
We talked about this last week, didn't we? The sort of the value of time wasting because it creates those social bonds between people. And actually, in the absence of the visual indicators you get in the office, people are actively sharing their sourdough starters or and news about puppies, because it creates that glue that helps you function as a team and relate to one another as humans. And that's critical, something we absolutely shouldn't lose as we move into this kind of new abnormal.
And it's what we might lose from personal contact from being less in the same physical space together. Actually, we're opening up new sorts of contact and allowing people to have the space to do that. I can't remember if we touched on this last week, but when new technologies are introduced, if you think about when the internet first, World Wide Web first became available in businesses, it was incredibly restricted. And it was only given to people who could be trusted with it. And you were only to do things that were work related. And there's still organizations that basically still work on that principle. Email was the same. When I started working in 1993, I had an email account, but I didn't have an external internet account for the first 3 years of my career, because that was only for special people who could be trusted with it. I went into a government department a couple of years ago and it was still the case, but that's another story.
Wow.
I know. If you think about when the telephone was first introduced, the early telephone companies in the United States spent enormous amounts of effort trying to be able to tell people not to waste time on the telephone. And then they realized that unless you start to use this stuff for social, for tittle tattle, for just, flim flam, people won't learn how to use it. And getting people.
No, precisely so. I mean, you've done this as well. If you do any kind of enterprise social network rollout, you focus on, the use cases you've identified for business. But the thing that draws people in is the softer stuff, and that's when you learn the behaviours, and that once you learn those, you can start to apply them to work-based context. So things like a running forum may not have a lot of obvious business value, but it's the sort of thing that helps people to understand how they use the tools, in which case they allow them to do that sort of adaptive flexibility, and in turn be able to use it for work purposes. So there's lots of overlaps here between the need to express your personality, to relate to one another as humans, but also to understand how can I, by sharing what I'm doing with my puppy, with my bread or whatever it is that I'm making, I'm actually starting to make sense of this way of working. And that's kind of critical, particularly at this stage, as people are bedding into this new way of getting stuff done.
Oh, absolutely. I don't know if it's an apocryphal story or not, but when I did the Who Shares Wins research for Leading Edge Forum 4 or 5 years ago, the story about how email was adopted in a law firm, which was that somebody set up a internal mailing list for updates of cricket scores, and the senior partners were very sniffy about this stuff until one of them realized that they could be updated on the cricket score while still being able to maintain a telephone conversation with client. And that was the thing that won the argument about email being introduced. So in terms of some of the negative things, I think there's on that point about how we start to also see not only is location shifting, but hours are shifting, so that the flexibility of working, particularly from home, where people can, and there are groups of people who don't have that option, either because of the nature of the work they do or because actually they just don't have the space physically to be able to work from home. But for those who can, as time that you work shifts, the interesting bit there, and this came up in a few of the conversations we've had so far, is about effectively diary etiquette, and sharing of diaries becomes so much more important, and it not just being free busy time. And that still, I think in loads of organisations, you find that there are people who still believe that it is their right almost to be private about everything that they do in work hours. And that doesn't work if everybody's having to be more adaptive and flexible in terms of how time works as well as how location works. And we're certainly going to pick up on a piece of work around just fostering a bit more about good diary etiquette, but also I've been working with a thing called Bookings, which is a part of the Office 365 suite I'd never encountered before, that enables you to expose diaries to the outside world.
Oh.
And so I've now got a page.
Calendly, but for corporates.
Exactly. And it's I can now give you a link to a page. If you want to have a meeting with me, it gives you not only the ability to see my free and busy time based on my working hours and what other appointments I have, but also at a click of a button to be able to book an appointment with me. So it gives me the ability to outsource all of that diary management work to people outside, but that's a trust building thing because I'm giving you access to my diary.
Yeah.
And tools like that to be able to help people to be able to work more effectively within this, I think can be really important. There's
What else have
also,
we got here? There's
yeah,
definitely some talk about the social side there, isn't there?
definitely some stuff about not having the face-to-face contact, without doubt. I think there's also some practical stuff. So talk about for people who have key cards, and many of our staff.
Of course, I
On,
hadn't thought that.
if you can see how much electricity you're using, and if you're home all day, you're using more electricity. How does that work? How do there's another one actually we've got, which we have a pool car fleet for people to use, which means people have to go into the office to pick up a pool car. Pool cars are going to be really hard to be able to operate with social distancing, trying to work out the logistics of that. Can we allow our staff to be able to actually, rather than having the pool car on site, take it home at night so they don't have to go to the office to be able to then do the work the next day? But then you get into things like tax implications, because then it becomes not a pool car but a company car. And
can you do things like subscriptions to other car services like Zipcar?
Yeah, quite possibly. And those would be interesting things to explore. I think it also though touches on, we've got a whole bunch. If say a third of the workforce suddenly becomes remote working in the next 6 months, and they actually contractually become home workers, so are moving so that their place of work is home, I think that Inland Revenue is going to struggle with that. Because that's
organisations will struggle with it. And, I mean, we haven't touched on that previously, but part of the Facebook announcement this week, it was a strange time to announce it, was to say we're expecting 50% of people to move, or was it 50? I can't remember, 8% of staff to move to remote working as their permanent way of working. And they set out some conditions for that, which were a little bit unusual. It has to be agreed by your team and the type of work. But they also announced with that they would localise people's pay based on where they live, which sort of makes sense, doesn't it? In that if you're getting a Silicon Valley salary, but you're living in a backwater in Ohio, you're going to be rich as creatures. But and they don't need that to attract people. The reason they pay you Silicon Valley salaries is because it's an incredibly expensive place to live. But the concept of things like London waiting, we talked about on Twitter, didn't we?
Yeah.
That we are going to have to, on the one hand, compensate people to work in their home environment, but on the flip side of that is we won't need to compensate people to live in expensive places because we're based there, which has very interesting implications rather for the whole pay and reward structure.
Well, for property prices as well. If
you
think about that and the indication of that going through, I mean, already people are talking about how there's going to be a escape to the country.
I'm cynical about that one. I mean, I think there will for some people at certain times of life, but it's not happening overnight. People have got lives and children and neighbours and communities, and cities are still good places to live. But the type of home you live in might change. So at least people won't, I think it won't be people leaving. It may be just a drip of people not arriving in London over depending on how long this goes on, it could just bounce back to exactly how it was. But people will still want to move to big cities because they're exciting places to live, particularly when you're younger. Social life will one way or another bounce back. People still want to go on dates and down the pub in whatever format you can. But I think more people want a home office, or at least not a studio flat.
And that's the thing, isn't it, about having to be able to have that space at home. So there's some interesting implications around all of that. Just a couple of other things to point out before we get back to the table. With the people involved in the schemes, not being on site as much means having to be able to give responsibility for things to third parties. So, for example, we've got lots of additional cleaning resource in at the moment. Safety checks being done by third parties, and actually having to let things go if you want to be able to not be constantly in the same physical space. And I think that might manifest in many different ways. And that's also something about control and ownership. And then also for people who are customer facing, face-to-face contact with our residents, how will that change if you're not around as much? And then will the value that they see in those roles, and we see this within offices as well, but if you're not physically present, the question then about, are you in the eyes of your customers or in the eyes of your peers being seen as valuable? Because there's the thing about managers and the stuff that you talked about last week about object permanence. and this idea that if you can't see something, it still exists. I'm talking to Dave Coplin on the podcast on WB40 this week, and he talked about research he did where actually they found that trust from managers in their employees was important, but also actually trust in peers was as important, and how you go about being able to demonstrate your value by your outputs or outcomes, not just to your manager through performance processes, but also to other people in the organization so that they know why you're there and what you do. And that's
I had this conversation with a client this week as well. They were, we were talking about what's the definition of productivity, and the truth is, for most of us, since we moved away from producing physical things, there isn't one. That as a result, but when we are working more distributed ways, we do need to demonstrate that we're doing something, and that's going to be a huge challenge, particularly in either public sector organisations that need to demonstrate that taxpayer money is being effectively spent, but also for things like pay and bonuses for organisations that use those to demonstrate what you delivered and how it aligned with the organisation's objectives and overall delivery. So there's a big challenge there in being able to, because so little of what many of us who are knowledge workers do can be demonstrated through an obvious output, we by definition have to measure demonstrate it through outcomes. We have to show a lot of those outputs, and those are all we have. And there's a conflict there with what we talked about last week in terms of we rely on documents as a way of demonstrating we did something that day.
Yeah. Or meetings, and maybe that's what's happening at the moment. I'm very productive at the moment. Yeah, there's no space in my diary. I'm therefore productive. Oh boy! Right, let's get back to the new abnormal table then. So we got down to spaces. How do we think spaces might need to be able to?
We talked about this last week, didn't we? That I'm really struck by, I think I shared this with you. I have a WeWork membership, which is quite handy, or was in the before times, as someone who moves around the place and works in lots of different cities. That if I've got 2 different meetings in the day, I can pop into WeWork in between and get some work done in a relatively productive space where I can just sit down, turn it on, the Wi-Fi works, and there's coffee available. But actually, so in order to reassure their members, they've sent this briefing note around that shows how they can operate effectively in an era of social distancing. And the long and short of it is they can't. It shows you on this, little various diagrams of their different spaces that says, in this breakout area of 10 people, we can safely seat 2. In which case it's not a breakout area, it's 2 people sitting on their own. So actually, and then it showed, we'll space people out when getting in the elevator, but then you still need to get in the lift, don't you, with the other people in an enclosed space, which is a risk. So even as I've got another client as well, they're going back to the office soon because they're in a country that's further ahead of the UK, but all the meeting rooms are closed off because it's not possible to safely socially distance in a meeting room at this stage. So even if we are getting back to the office, actually the things that we say, right, we can work effectively from home on individual work, but we still need spaces to do meetings and creative work. But those spaces aren't going to be available, at least not now. So we have to find other ways of getting that stuff done. The thing that you would normally do, let's scribble on a whiteboard and get some ideas together. How do you do that while standing 2 meters apart? Well,
you don't. What you do is what we're doing right now.
Exactly. Which doesn't require you to be in the same physical space.
Yeah, and actually, the more that I get into using tools like this one, it's going to sound like an advert, but I'm absolutely obsessed with Miro, I don't know how you pronounce it. And the reason is because it's allowing me to be able to do things collaboratively with people in a way that you can't do in physical space. You can have more people engaged in a way that is more creative, is more equal and equitable, and enables you to be able to do things that you just wouldn't be able to do on a whiteboard. You can't run video on a whiteboard.
So should we talk about the World Cup?
Yeah, let's talk about the World Cup.
Okay, so Well, I borrowed it off a Twitter game that's run by a TV presenter, Richard Osman, where he will present any one of a number of categories. So you can pick an object, a type of thing, and then you're trying to decide what the best one of that thing is, which you can do by debating one against the other in a series of playoffs. Some friends and I, while we've been in lockdown, as a little bit of a focus for the Zoom-based socialisation that we've all been forced to do on a Saturday night, I've started moving to doing the World Cup of, insert a category here, and using Miro to run that. So you can develop a chart that says, we did one of the best king. So we had, Tiger King versus Billie Jean King. And following that on, you can decide what the best king is. And then you borrowed it and took it next level using Miro.
Yes, I had to bring it up because it was such good fun. Which it's a ridiculous subject. It was the World Cup of 1990s UK and Ireland indie bands. The eventual winner, Teenage Fan Club.
Worthy winner, to be fair.
Absolutely, yeah. But if you see this, so every one of these has got a video next to it, which is just off Vivo or on YouTube or whatever. And the ability to be able to just click and drag and pull this stuff together and share this and have multiple people interacting with this virtual space is mad. It's incredible. It's just
so it's so much richer than doing just like a board that you might be doing in an office, because you can have that
sorry,
on the wrong one. You can add that level of interaction and make it richer. It's great. So actually we've been doing something similar, but we've been flipping over to YouTube to evidence our arguments. But it does make it feel like you're not just recreating the whiteboard experience you'd have in the office, but making it better. Yeah. Enhancing it.
And I think that becomes then a question about how do you train people to be able to use virtual spaces, and how do you give them experience? And this thing about, the reason about talking about the World Cup game is not because it's important to know the Teenage Fan Club, according to that exercise, of the world's best.
It's quite a good fun game. Do recommend it if you're a bit bored.
But it's that thing about actually finding ways like that are fun and engaging to be able to actually get people to get familiar with the tool, so that they're not having to get familiar with it in the pressure of actually important business stuff. And one of the reasons why I think interactive technology in meeting rooms has always really struggled is that, say, an interactive whiteboard, the only time you're ever going to get into a meeting room that's got a big flash interactive whiteboard is at a time when you're in a big flash important meeting. And so the last thing that you want to do is risk experimenting with technology when you're doing something really important. So you end up using it, if you use it at all, just like a normal whiteboard. You don't explore.
That is a very fair point. I think when I was working at Big Bank, the times at which you actually got one of the flashiest meeting rooms is to present the thing that you spent 3 weeks putting together. At which point you just click through the PowerPoint.
Exactly. And the thing about these kind of tools, whether it's whiteboarding Teams or whether it's Miro or whether it's, even slightly more structured things like Trello or Planner, everybody has access to them. That barrier to entry of using like one of the Surface Hubs, these massively expensive, whizzy, whiteboardy things, was that there were only a few in the organisation, and you couldn't just get time to go in there and muck around with it, because it would always be subscribed. And
there's a parallel there. Do you remember when offices had video conferencing rooms and you had to book them in advance?
Yeah.
And now, of course, we can all get video conferencing technology at our desks, regardless of where that desk is, or on our phone.
Exactly.
And now it's a democratization of access to collaboration tools. So now they are no longer just available in a small section of the organization, but actually everyone should have access to them. So actually going back to this spaces theme then. So should we give a quick overview of, I think, what we meant by this? That physical spaces are really important to organizations for lots of reasons. One is that obviously physically bring people together and give them a space to work in, but they serve other functions as well. They give us a connection with place. And for an organisation like yours, that's literally the community in which you're bedded in. But for, if you think about big banks, at Canary Wharf or on the Bay at Hong Kong, they've got the world's most expensive real estate with their massive logo on the outside. It says something about who they are and that they're a viable organisation. not having a physical office does make you slightly less trusted by people, or rather it used to, certainly in the past. But they're also like a status symbol. We have this big flashy Canary Wharf office, therefore we are. So that's definitely changing. I suspect, again, that won't change immediately, but if we are going to be working from home for a substantial period, those organisations that are they're now talking about, we're going to be doing this for a year, 2 years, who knows, or moving permanently to having a large part of their workforce home based, means that they're not physically not going to need as much space. So in the short term, there's going to be a retrenchment from secondary spaces at the very least. So thinking about, HSBC, for example, they have obviously the big tower in Canary Wharf. They've also got loads of secondary spaces. They've got a WeWork presence, where they're trying to convince people they're cool. They'll be dumping quite a lot of that sort of stuff, I should imagine. So we're in this kind of remote working holding pattern in that there's spaces and they're physically sitting empty at the moment. Where do they go next? So you've put that around the end of WeWork. I think you're right in that their business model was interesting.
Well, it was going anyway, wasn't it? Let's be honest.
Long before any of this happened. But there may be a role for other physical spaces. So, for example, we talked before about not everyone can or will want to work from home because of those things we talked about missing the social life, or maybe just, things like the cost of paying your electricity and bills at home, or just not having enough room. Are we talking about the emergence of more localized WeWork type spaces that are much more community based? So no one wants to, again, one of the benefits you talked about there was I don't need to get on the train for 3.5 hours a day. Brilliant. But you might still want to walk 10 minutes down the road to your local high street. So is it that we start to reconfigure some office space or other places that are more community embedded? So Barclays is an interesting one because they're talking about, they own their physical branches, but they lease most of their offices. So as obviously fewer of us are going to branches, we do our banking online, and they don't want people going into the office, chances are they may start using, they talked about this in a recent news story, using their physical branches as kind of localized co-work spaces for staff who live in that area, which is quite an interesting model and one that could be.
And this is the stuff the Irish-based community organisation Grow Remote has been looking at to help build up Irish rural communities where the network infrastructure has been put in place for people to be able to work remotely. Hubs have been set up, and what they're doing is coordinating how do you get a sense of local community with people who work remotely for lots of different organisations. Grow Remote's time has really come, I think, in terms of what they've been looking at. And I think it's just this question about all these assumptions that we have. So one question that I think before we move on to the next one is that symbolism of the big flash office. We are real, we are here because we have the 3rd floor of the Shard or whatever.
Yeah.
72nd floor, just the 3rd floor. And what will there be anything that replaces that? Because the idea of, and this might be ludicrous, but it might not be, is that, prestige video conferencing services or virtual meeting spaces as opposed to normal ones. Is there going to be a white glove equivalent for digital services that enables people to be able to say, look how, the way that, say, law firms, I've done work in city law firms, and city law firms, all their offices are identical, and you get whisked to the top floor in the guest lift, the special client lift, and it's all white glove service and all the rest of it, and it's all there to say, look, we're worth the money that you might spend with us, because look at how beautiful this is. Talks about,
so they don't want your CEO in his tracksuit bottoms at home.
Exactly. But will there be digital equivalents of that white glove service to be able to replace the physical space where people are using that for the semiotics of saying, look how big, important, valuable.
It's a fair point, isn't that? And I know, and that we're differentiating ourselves through the quality of what we're providing to that end audience.
So, right.
So, what
Next
we've got
up,
here really then as a summary of that theme is there's going to be a real minimization of office space, but we need to think about what that is genuinely for. What is it that physical spaces are genuinely better for? And is it that white glove thing? Is it, do we still need it for prestige or proof of life?
Yeah, that's genuinely good for. Because actually, physical space has only been there because of the resources that we used to have to tie ourselves to, because it was basically like a factory. The office was like a factory. You needed machines that were in the office to be able to do your work. That's not been the case for years, but we carried on going to the office because it seemed like that's where we needed to be.
Right. Okay, let's crack on with corporate communication. So it's been a tough time to be in internal comms and corporate comms. That they've been in, recovery mode for some time now. And, in the space of a week, they've had to completely change the way that they communicate, set up new channels and so on. So I've differentiated here between corporate communication, which is how the organisation and its leadership communicates to the people who work there about its goals and values and aligns you as an employee with them, and talks about things like progress and strategy and so on. Now, that had moved over many years from being much more top-down and hierarchical, postbox type thing, to a more multi-directional approach that was more multimedia, with comms kind of playing the role of controller in there. They would understand what's happening in the organisation and communicate it, reflect it back to organisations, to the people who work there. Now, switching into recovery mode has forced them to rapidly take charge of a huge period of change, but the result has been an overwhelming growth of broadcasts. So everyone is switching to, here's the CEO doing a video on Zoom, here is a bunch of emails about what we're doing to keep you safe. But it's definitely seen almost a backward step in how corporate communications has worked, with partly due to resource challenges. There's a lot to communicate in a really short time. So but also the need to, often they don't have the tools to do that as well. So much of what corporate communications have done has been, based on physical spaces. So it could be physical events, but also posters, digital signage, a lot of things that are related to physical space. So there's no clear answer to this one, except that corporate communicators need to rethink their comms architecture for a remote first workforce. So I did a discovery exercise with an organisation in February to March, and we were just in the process of putting the findings together to make some recommendations on what they should start and stop and so on in their digital workplace, intranet space. And the reality is a lot of that has become irrelevant before we've even delivered it, that actually their needs have radically shifted, and they've set up a bunch of new channels in between the time of us doing that research and presenting the findings back to them. But there will be a need to think about how is it that people work when they're working remotely, and what are their user needs. We need a much more user needs focused approach to corporate comms and organizational comms. So people have rushed to set up things like Zoom and Slack channels. There's still a need for pull channels. How do I find things when I'm working on my own? How do I access resources about what the organization is doing? There's a lot of push and not a lot of pull channels at the moment. So there's a need to, I guess, understand that a lot more. What do you think?
I think it's interesting because I've been exploring what you can do with Microsoft Teams. And as is the case with most corporate software, enterprise software, productivity software, I reckon that most organizations are using about 5% of it.
Yeah, standard.
Did you know, for example, there's a thing called Who in Teams, which gives you a chat that enables you to be able to ask, who is the CEO? Or who are my co-workers? Or who works in this department? And based on the information that it's got within the directory information, it will return information for you. That's just there. You have to enable it as an app. There's an immense amount of this functionality available, but nobody's ever really explored it. And so I think there's there's a need for curiosity, and I think there's also a need, I think, on this.
But is it curiosity or also space? So you need time to be curious.
Well, you need time to be able to do it, absolutely. But I think there needs to be within, I think within a lot of disciplines, and I think particularly in the comms world, the HR world, there tends to be too much reliance on best practice than on exploration, experimentation, and seeing what works, and being willing to be able to try some stuff out. And most importantly, if it doesn't look like it's working, either change it or kill it.
Yeah.
And
this period is allowing some of that. So for instance, we've seen lots of organizations go, rapidly adopt Zoom or video-based ways of working and get a sense of what's working, what isn't, from that. But yeah, there is a need to take much more of an iterative test and learn approach to what's actually getting cut through. But interestingly, this is where we need to start thinking about stuff like, actually, do we need to borrow things from the world of digital marketing and get a sense of, actually, is stuff genuinely being read? And use much more of a, for instance, if you're sending out digital marketing email, you can do retargeting to understand, actually, if someone has a really important compliance message, we know you haven't read it. Is there a need to think about a lot more of that around kind of targeting and relevance, because people are just getting a lot of stuff?
Well, so I could play devil's advocate on that.
Yeah.
I would say that actually most digital marketing is just exercises in throwing enormous amount of cheap mud against a massive wall.
Okay, I said borrow for the best of digital marketing. And so I'm thinking about things like targeting and retargeting. No,
retargeting is the worst. But I'll give you a case in point. I've signed up to Miro. I am now, well, my organisation is now paying money to Miro for us to use these tools. I keep getting retargeted adverts saying, do I want to buy Miro? Right?
Yeah,
the last thing that I want to know from an organisation that I am paying money to is that some of that money is being spent explicitly on me trying to be able to get me to become a customer when I'm already a customer, right?
So I've seen some really good examples of this working internally at a large pharma firm that actually, for instance, they produce one newsletter, but it's got 10,000 variants based on a number of attributes, based on, physically where you are, what kind of role you have, the content you've interacted with previously. Crucially, if there are things they have to tell you and you haven't read them before, they can send them to you again. So I'm thinking about borrowing, there's bad digital marketing, but there are some good practices there that would
you might have hit a trigger word for me there. I'm just conscious we've got 10 minutes left.
Right, let's wrap
I've got a drop dead because it's violin lessons at 9 o'clock and you really don't want to hear the violin lessons. So corp comms, so just explain again that differentiation between corporate comms and org comms.
Okay, so org comms is actually around how people talk to one another. So corporate communication stuff is the stuff the organisation needs to tell you and wants to, it's about aligning you with organisational purpose. Organisational communication from this perspective is just how people talk to one another to get stuff done. It's a shame we left this one till last. There's quite a lot to say here. When you work in the office, that communication is implicit. You can lean across the desk and say, hey Dave, are you working on this? Do you know where this file is? Can you tell me the latest on this customer, or whatever it might be? It's largely synchronous in that it happens while you're both in the room, or at worst you can send someone an email. As we've shifted to this recovery mode that we have now, that's still synchronous, hence the million Zoom calls that we're on, but we're having to be much more explicit about our communication. You can't just say, or lean over the desk and ask someone. So it has to be much more deliberate. But that's exhausting for people. Everyone's already talking about this Zoom fatigue. So the best practice is really for making that work in the long term is shifting to, on the one hand, keeping that deliberation, that working out loud, but try and find ways to make it more asynchronous so that it's just not so tiring.
Yeah. And I think part of that actually is by mixing up the modes a bit. And so being able to have things in front of people that aren't just other people's faces, for example. And I think the other bit is also, as we get more flexible, we also need to think way more about asynchronous
Exactly. So actually, not just because being on a call with someone, it requires that you both you pay attention on the call, but also at some point you have to note down what you said. Whereas adopting asynchronous mode mean I can dip in and find what was discussed. So a much underrated way of communication is the collaborative document. I write a note, you write a note, we change a bit. I can refer back to it at any point in the future, and more to the point, it becomes part of the intellectual capital of that organisation, because it's noted down what we as an organisation have done, learned, discussed. So there's huge value in adopting those, but that requires people to know that they exist and understand how they can adopt those tools, which I think may segue us neatly onto the following line. But unless we're missing something here.
Well,
but
the only other question I have is actually something that I've been wondering for some time, and I think maybe is a question to raise now as well, is should corporate communication start to think more of itself as being a facilitator of organisational communication rather than something that is a bit like kind of marketing but looked down upon by marketers? And so, for example, the corporate grapevine, and we've a couple of things happening at my organisation in the last few days. The corporate grapevine is as active and as effective as it ever has been. If you want to get a message out, it can be really quite hard. If you want to stop a message getting out, somehow magically it seems to be in everybody's ears almost immediately. And so why doesn't, if you think about, what can we learn from digital marketing? Why don't corporate communication spend more time learning from how messages naturally propagate within organizations and then hack that rather than to be able to be something that looks like it should be, mainstream media, but isn't, because it's not quite as good or interesting.
Well, so this I guess it comes down to, do we think of organizational communication as part of ways of working? Like, there's two sides. We talked about skills and roles last time, and I think we're about to talk about support, which is helping people to become more digitally literate, or rather, maybe not digital literacy, but digital confidence, shall we say. And where people are navigating a increasingly complex landscape of tools, there is a need to support them in doing that, help them to fix problems, troubleshoot. But then there's something there around helping people to become more skilled themselves and to support their peers. I actually wonder whether we need to merge this line into skills and roles, which we already merged.
Yeah, I think that might well be. I think so. There's interesting things there. So I've been, having had these conversations, there's some things that have been going in my head. So when I discover something that I think might be useful, because I'm the head of technology, I've kind of got a platform with probably more. I'm not going to say credibility, because basically that'd be nonsense. But I have, because of my role, the ability to be able to share messages which people will take maybe a bit more from, because I'm head of technology. So if I find something that's interesting that I can do, like yesterday I worked out how you can put Outlook into Teams, so you don't need to keep going back into Outlook. Which might be neat for some people. 2-minute video, whack that onto Yammer, and is shared with it. And that part of what I'm doing there is to be able to say, oh, look, here's something interesting that might help you work more effectively. But the other thing that I'm hopefully doing is signaling to other people, if you find something useful, tell people about it. Actually is something that people will do implicitly or even explicitly within an office space, but we really need to actually put a little bit more effort into doing it in a remote only environment. And it's those.
So I guess the answer is, what is that effort? That do we need? We talked about roles and skills before. That at the moment, for instance, if you're in a workplace, there'll be one help desk for Ask HR. There'll be another help desk for IT, and you kind of have to know: is this an IT thing? It's kind of IT, but it's also a bit of HR. So actually, it relies on the end user to navigate too much complexity. So there needs to be a way of being able to say, I have X problem, and have a single solution. But that solution is partly around being able to access tips from other people, access support from the community as well, as in from your colleagues.
Yeah. and I think an interesting part of that, and so I was chatting with some people last night about organizational structures and who it's good for the head of technology to report into. And I've got my perfect structure at the moment and I've been talking about this for years and years and years. My boss, as executive director, is responsible for all business services other than finance. So it's my peers are the head of HR, the head of comms, the head of learning and development, the head of facilities, and the head of health and safety. And we work as a team, and we've got some work to do to be able to really get it, in gear with each other. But in one directorate, we have responsibility for all of the services that support the business doing business. So we have the opportunity to be able to do that thing about a single place to go for everything. We're not there yet.
Yeah.
But I think that part of the issue there is that what traditional support mechanisms do is they reinforce the internal silos. So
that's violin lesson coming up.
It is violin lesson coming up. Right. So we'll put this this whiteboard. There'll be a link to this underneath the video on the YouTube. The conversation continues.
I'll be writing it up as a blog post, so people can scan that and read and comment as well. That'd be really useful.
Fabulous. And we'll continue to explore what I think is just going to be basically the next few years.
Yeah, I feel like we need to evolve the actual chart now to version 2, incorporating quite a lot of this stuff, but I'll leave that till next week.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sharon. Great to see you.
Yeah, you too. Speak soon. Cheers.
Cheers.